it's possible that at a certain point he did say, okay, we have to have war. Maybe not until March of 1861. I certainly don't think he came into Washington or came into the presidency in terms of his presidency elect thinking we must have war. But certainly when he came to Washington, I think he began to see that there was not going to be a solution.
We were talking a little bit beforehand, and you mentioned to me how the experience that Lincoln had in Congress, I'm finding positive things here, but you said there were some negatives to him.
Well, I think there are a couple of negatives, and it sort of depends on your viewpoint about it. The war is something that I think a lot of people say, it was horrible that we had to have the war, but it was also important to have the war to free 4 million slaves. So it's a tricky proposition to talk about that. But I think one of the things that's important to recognize about Lincoln and from his experiences in Washington is that he got a very particular impression of what Southerners were like. And his impression was mostly wrong. The people that he was meeting were people in Washington, right? Not the people who were living in Milledgeville, Georgia, and were having a different kind of experience. And so his perception of what Southerners would do was very different from what they actually did do. And I think that's part of the problem. That's part of why I think he misunderstood a lot during the period in which he was president-elect, how the issues could have been solved. But there's an even more important way, I think, in which he had sort of a negative experience. And that was something when he wasn't in Washington. This is something I talk about in the book in his 1858 campaign against Douglas for the Senate. While Lincoln is gone, Douglas develops a very important relationship in Washington with a fellow by the name of John Crittenden, who was Henry Clay's successor in the Senate and who was a very strong Unionist. And Crittenden had been a Taylor supporter in 1848. Lincoln certainly knew him. They had been somewhat friendly in Washington. But Crittenden, while Lincoln was gone, had developed this relationship with Douglas. And during the 1858 campaign, Crittenden supported Douglas. And this really upset Lincoln. Lincoln thought that he should be behind Lincoln, because they had known each other. They both came from the Whig Party. And because Douglas had been the author of the terrible Kansas-Nebraska Act. But what had happened in the meantime is that Douglas and Crittenden had developed this friendship as a result of living in Washington. And I think this had a big impact on Lincoln because I know we can debate it a little bit. He didn't like Douglas very much. He didn't really like the fact that Crittenden was supporting him, and I think he held this against Crittenden long after the 1858 campaign. Crittenden would have been a very smart choice for Lincoln's cabinet. He didn't even consider him. Yeah. So it had the impact of creating this friendship that in the end was not so good for Lincoln. So that's how I would say it was a negative.
It's interesting that he did that to Crittenden, but to Stanton, who certainly insulted him greatly, his lawyer, brought him right back in. He needed him.
Yeah, he did need him. I think he'd learned by then. I think he'd learned. But this really hurt Lincoln deeply, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk quickly about the great triumvirate
that
was in Congress. And, of course, we know those as Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. A daunting group, no?
Yeah.
How did they set the congressional tone, both in protocol and in sectionalism? What were those protocols, by the way? Briefly there, too.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about those three is that we have our picture of Congress, I think, more from them than from anyone else. Because when they gave speeches on the floor of the Senate and the House, people did listen. People did care. People did have an interest. When Clay gave his speeches on the Compromise of 1850, the galleries were packed and everyone was sitting and listening. So it's easy to imagine Washington and Congress generally as this picture. But this was not so much the case, and it took Clay a long time to get to that position where people would listen to him that much. But the three of them were very much involved in the day-to-day life of Washington. Clay, in particular, was known as a little bit of a drinker. But Webster, too. Webster was even rumored to have fathered a black child during one of his bouts with alcohol. And Calhoun was really involved in some scandalous activity. So I think part of what they were able to do is to create or be part of this Washington community where people talk to one another. Frequently, they were all very warm personalities in some ways. In some ways not. Webster in particular could be sort of difficult. But the three of them really brought people together. When you had a party and Clay was there, you wanted to go. Because Clay was the life of the party. So I think they set the tone in that way. They were all very sensitive, though. They didn't like when people said nasty things about them. So by the time that we're talking about when Lincoln is around, for example, they can get angry about things and storm off. But before that, they had been a really important part of the Washington community.
Were there some other odd couples? I mean, I would think Alexander Stephens and Lincoln is
It's a real odd couple, yeah.
There. Yet they did have, in fact, Stephens, as you also explain in the book, when Lincoln was elected, tried to tell his fellow Southerners, it ain't that bad.
No?
And they saw him as more of a conservative, and maybe they saw someone who didn't want that war to come.
That's right.
Although on the other side of it, I think he did. But that's different. Go ahead.
One of my favorite odd couples is Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, and William Seward, Lincoln's future Secretary of State. They were very good friends, and at one point when Davis was quite ill, Seward came over and brought him soup and nursed him back to health, and so they had become quite friendly. And this is a real odd couple. Seward's wife was a serious abolitionist, was participating in the Underground Railroad and had really made her opinions well known, but it's okay. Seward and Jefferson Davis got along just fine, and they spent time arguing about politics and talking about the experience of slavery. And so as a result, again, when we get to the secession crisis, Seward really thinks that he can fix this. He really thinks that he can get Southerners on board to try to create some sort of compromise. And this relationship had that big impact.
You know, George Orwell's 1984. I thought about this through the book because George Orwell saw a country that was going to be controlled by the government, have all power in the government. And in a way, so did they, at this time, think that they could fix it. They could have it. But we now know today that the individual can have as much, if not more. A hacker can come through, a Snowden can come through. One individual can have a huge impact on the nation and the world. So that's where power almost resides now. And in a way, this is what I was thinking here, outside this bubble, that's where the power resided because it broke that bubble apart and the war came again.
And this is all about sort of the contingencies of people meeting each other and coming together in opposition to Washington, right? William Freeling has a wonderful part in his book, The Road to Disunion, Volume 2, where he talks about a railroad convention in South Carolina and Georgia where South Carolinians and Georgians come together and discuss the issue of disunion. So going outside of Washington and looking at these personal relationships is also really important.
I'm going to put you to work for a moment, signing. All I have to do is open up right there and sign a name. There are a number of people who have asked for books. So if you'll do that while I give you an idea, everyone out there, on our upcoming virtual book signings. Saturday, February 15th at noon, Ray Amy will be here. Abraham Lincoln in the Kitchen, a culinary view of Lincoln's life and times. Can't say we're going to have a kitchen in here working, but we're going to give it a shot. Thursday, April 24th at 6 p.m. Now we're going kind of far up, but we want to let you know. Shawana Devine, Learning from the Wounded. And we may have an all-medical show on that in April. That'll be very interesting. Both of these books, by the way, come from Rachel's University of North Carolina Press. And we thank UNC for being so supportive, as many other publishers are, of course, of virtual book signing. In March, we're hoping that we'll have the celebrated historian of slavery, David Bryan Davis, with his third book of his trilogy on the problem of slavery in the age of emancipation. So we're hoping to have that in March as well. Of course, I want to thank everyone who has been watching us today, and all of you who have come out, relatives or not. Relatives don't come out all that often, so I think it's a good thing. And UNC Press, and of course, and I want to thank everyone here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, the staff, for their help. We couldn't do this without them. I want to ask you another question. Looking at your footnotes, which is great fun.
Yeah.
You had an interesting discussion in there about fundamentalists and revisionists in today's historical world.
Yeah.
So give us a quick overview of what the fundamentalists versus the revisionists are doing right now.
Well, I don't know how much they're doing right now, but there are sort of two ways of thinking about the coming of the Civil War that have existed for years and years and years, generations of historians, and we call them fundamentalists and revisionists often. Fundamentalists tend to argue that the coming of the Civil War was based on fundamental differences between North and South very early in the historiography. So we're thinking at the very beginning of the 20th century, people argued about what those fundamental differences were. Were they about the economy? Were they about issues involving tariffs in particular? But most historians today talk about that in the issue of slavery, that there's a fundamental difference between North and South on the issue of slavery. And most of these historians argue that the Civil War was inevitable because of this fundamental difference. Revisionists tend to say that the war was not inevitable, that it came when it came because of a series of contingencies, of individual actions, of individual experiences, like the secession crisis and how the secession crisis unfolded. And they tend to argue that politics in particular helped create these situations. I would say that in the 21st century, we are finally starting to get away from the fundamentalists and the revisionists. I think we can all argue there was indeed a fundamental difference between North and South in the issue of slavery, but politics brought the war when it did. So thinking about the timing of the war. And part of the importance of thinking about this question is in thinking about why people behave the way they do. And some people behave the way they do because of the issue of slavery, and some people don't. And Northerners in particular are very divided about this. It's not right to think of the North as this wonderful anti-slavery bastion of liberty, right? This is not the way most people in the North felt in the 19th century. Most of them were just as racist as the people of the South. They just didn't like the idea of slave labor. They had no feelings whatsoever about the slaves themselves. And so thinking about it in terms of personal understanding and personal experience is part of what I tried to do, to show there were indeed some people in Washington in this period who did care a lot about the issue of slavery from the North, and there were many people who did not. And so they came in with these different ideas, and as a result, things turned out the way they did.
Well, before we end, what is your next virtual book signing book going to be?
My next project is on judicial ethics in the 19th century, the way that the Supreme Court in particular understood the community around them and what was acceptable, what was not acceptable, thinking about how they should interact with the lawyers that came before them and other politicians.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. And UNC Press, as I've said, for bringing you for the Washington Brotherhood, Politics, Social Life, and the Coming of the Civil War. I think you're all going to want to read this. It's an excellent book. We appreciate your being here and your book as well. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.